Welcome to Tower Talks. I'm Jonathan Brunt, the government editor of the Spokesman-Review. I'm pleased today to have in the studio Todd Myers, the Vice President of Research at the Washington Policy Center. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, yeah.
And in Olympia, our state government reporter, Mitchell Roland.
Thank you for being here, Todd.
Yeah, it'd be nice to chat with you guys.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So, Washington Policy Center, I think often known as shorthand, a conservative think tank. And I don't think that's how you guys describe yourself. So go ahead. I want you to go ahead and describe what the Policy Center is.
Yeah, we are a free market public policy think tank. So we generally, people can generally consider us center right, but we are nonpartisan and we work with folks across the political spectrum. One of the jokes I tell is that what do Black Lives Matter and Donald Trump have in common, other than sort of generating nervous laughter, which is that both of them have endorsed policies that we have put forward in the last few years. Black Lives Matter supported a bill that we put forward on occupational licensing to reduce licensing barriers for low-income people, especially people who have been incarcerated and are looking for a second shot at life. And Donald Trump has supported our positions on Snake River dams. So there aren't many organizations that can claim that sort of breadth. So, I understand people try to pigeonhole ideologically, but we call ourselves free market, and whoever wants to work with us in those areas, we're happy to work with.
So I kind of wanted to start there because in a state that is very much controlled by Democrats at least at the state level,
yeah,
and all sides of the government, what kind of impact do you feel like you have had in the last few years? I assume you can't pick up the phone and call the governor's office or the majority leader or the Speaker of the House. You probably don't have many sit-down meetings with them, is my guess. So how do you influence things, and what would you say are your you can point to as this changed because we promoted it and lobbied for it?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple. Well, I just gave you one, which is in a situation where there are licensing barriers or things like that for low-income people. Like that's something we believe that barriers should be reduced to give people others opportunities. So there may be different reasons for why someone on the left and someone on the right would support a policy, but we look for those opportunities. I'll give you another situation generally before I get to a couple of specific examples, which is that I've done a lot of work over the past few years on tribal stewardship of natural resources. So I used to work at the Department of Natural Resources on forestry issues, was on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council, and what I found is that tribes do a fantastic job of managing natural resources. The Kalispels, the Colvilles. The Colvilles especially have a fantastic forestry program that we did a video with them about good stewardship of forests and to make sure that they are less fire-prone and more resilient. And that is a model that the state and the federal government should take. So that is not, I think people were sort of stereotyping. They would not think of us as working closely with tribes on natural resource issues, but we do because we have a lot of, we believe that local control and the accountability that goes with that creates really great environmental outcomes in a number of different areas. More specifically, this year, I can just give you two examples. In one case, there was a online security bill that was bipartisan to protect children from sort of online predators and things like that. And we looked at the bill and we found that in the legislation there was a clause that I don't understand why it was in there, but it said that when a social media company has to alert a minor, a child, when their parent is monitoring them. Now, I don't understand what the logic of that would be, but it was in there, and so we pointed that out to some of the sponsors on both sides of the aisle. Said, this doesn't make it. This sort of seems to undermine the goal of giving parents the ability to make sure that their children aren't being preyed upon. That got removed. So, that's a tangible example of when you go and you read line by line those bills and find things, that got fixed. I'll give you another one that's more consequential, at least for the west side of the state, is that in the transportation budget, there was a clause that was added that would allow transit agencies to move bond the length of bonds from, I think, 20 or 30 years to 75 years. Now, the amount of additional interest and cost, I mean, it almost doubles the interest cost when you extend bonds out that many years for no additional transit benefit. But it makes, in the short term, it makes transit books look better. Sound Transit, I think, was the one who was behind this. But it would have cost the state taxpayers, and it would have cost, Sound Transit taxpayers and other folks a lot of money. And then other folks across the state could have used it. Our transportation director found that, asked some questions about it, and got it removed. So, like, that literally could have saved tens of billions of dollars in taxpayer expenses over the course of that. So those are just two examples this year. So yeah, if you're looking for big ideological wins, right now, we're probably not going to get those. But you can find very meaningful wins, things that actually tangibly help people today because we do the work and because we can work with people even when we disagree with them.
All right. Mitchell, did you have a question?
Yeah. One of the other aspects of the Washington Policy Center is kind of reviewing laws that have already taken effect and kind of following up on them 5-10 years down the road and kind of checking the status and seeing if they're having their intended effect, what those unintended consequences have been.
Yeah.
One of the laws that you recently took a look at was the plastic ban bag that was implemented, I want to say 5 years ago. I know the Department of Commerce just came out with a study that was conducted by Washington State University researchers. I was hoping you could kind of shed a little bit more light on A, what that study found, and B, kind of what the impact of that law has actually been in Washington.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. One of the things that distinguishes us from political parties or sort of political action organizations is that we have a long-term view. So I've been at the Policy Center for 20 years. Our researchers have been around for years. And so we can go back and say, hey, whatever happened to that in a way that I think those who are focused on sort of near-term political wins or losses can't do. In the case of plastic bags, I've been working on this for years, and what the data showed was that plastic bag bans often backfire because the alternatives to the very thin plastic bags use more resources. And so when you do what's called a life cycle analysis, you find that the alternatives end up doing more environmental damage. It's not in the form of litter, right? Litter is very obvious and people can see it, but it's in the form of other things like fertilizer runoff into water. So we've passed this plastic bag. It's not a ban, right? It's banning the thin ones, and so now we have thicker ones, and the thickness is actually set in the law. And then a cost, which is now I think 10 cents or on the way to 12 cents. I can't remember exactly where we are, but there's a cost. So Department of Commerce sent the data to asked Washington State University researchers to look at it. What's the impact? And what they found is that sure enough, the number of plastic bags being used went down significantly by about half. I can tell you that in my own personal experience, right? I use fewer plastic bags. Although we have a dog, and so we have to find plastic bags to deal with our dog in a different way. So those are sort of the unintended consequences. But they found that overall, the number of bags went down significantly. But because the bags are so much thicker, the amount of plastic is actually increasing, and the total amount of plastic in the waste stream is increasing. So what they found is that it actually was probably doing more harm than good in those areas. So they turned that into the Department of Commerce last December. The Department of Commerce sat on it for 9 months. And then they put a 4-page rebuttal at the front of that report without telling the Wazoo researchers that basically said, okay, maybe this is true, but there are other reasons to have this, like social benefits and equity. Now, I suppose that's fine, right? There's more to the world than just, the amount of plastic in the waste stream. But it is convenient that they went from an objective metric, which is this increasing or decreasing plastic and waste, to extremely subjective metrics like equity and social benefit and things like that. And so what they simply said is, well, we're going to keep it because we think there are social benefits.
Do you think there's something that they could change about the plastic bag ban to lower people's use and waste of plastic?
I think that they should go back to the. I think they should go back to the thinner plastic bags. That was what was recommended by Wazoo, and I agree with that because the reason that those plastic bags were used before the law is that they were cheap, and they used so little material. One of the other aspects that Wazoo found is that because the new plastic bags are thicker, they're heavier to transport, so there's more costs for gasoline and other things like that associated with transport. So yeah, I think they should go back to that. If you're concerned about plastic getting into the water, which is one of the big things, it's like, oh, the plastic bags are trash, they get into the water, they impact marine life. The data show that there is, of course, an impact. Some of them do, but it's very tiny. Plastic in the ocean primarily comes from developing countries, especially Southeast Asia, but elsewhere, that don't have good trash collection systems. For the problems that thin plastic bags cause, they're not very much here. If you want to solve the problem of plastic ocean impact, that's where you go. And so that's why, like, there's a group. Occasionally I will offer a bet. Somebody will tell me I'm wrong, and I'll offer to bet them, and I will bet $50 to charity. And the charity of my choice is a group called Plastic Bank, which goes to those developing countries to keep plastic out of the ocean. And they're very effective at it. That's the way we need to do it, rather than these sort of symbolic gestures like plastic bag bans.
Let's talk about the Climate Commitment Act.
Yeah.
Policy Center has been opposed to this since it was passed.
Yep.
But I assume you agree that holding down carbon is a good goal.
Yeah, so I personally supported, the Policy Center was neutral, but I personally supported the 2016 revenue neutral carbon tax, which put a price on CO2 to provide a financial incentive to reduce CO2 emissions, but it also combined it with a cut in sales and some business taxes so that you wouldn't see the big increases in total tax bills that you see with the Climate Commitment Act. You would still provide the incentive to cut emissions without that big financial cost. So we have consistently taken positions to say, yes, there is risk from CO2, but let's make sure that we do it in such a way that is financially responsible and effective.
Okay. What do you think has been the impact of the Climate Commitment Act?
So I think there's been a couple of things. One, I think that it clearly will reduce CO2 emissions because the cap means that you can't sell gas, propane, things that emit CO2, natural gas. You can only sell a certain amount of it because the cap goes down every year. So that will happen. But there's a cost. And the way that it does that by auctioning essentially permits to emit, that cost goes up every year, right? Supply and demand. As supply goes down, if demand doesn't keep up, the costs going up. And that's what we have seen. The costs have gone up. In fact, the costs have doubled in just the past year and are now about 50 cents per gallon of gas. So that's the trade-off. The problem with a cap-and-trade system like we have, and what we have seen in other situations around the world is that the targets are set arbitrarily. In fact, in Washington State, it is a 45% reduction by 2030. It is not an accident that the target is divisible by 5, and it is not an accident that it's exactly on a decade, right? That is not generated by science. It's not generated by an economic study. It's what sounded good to politicians. To achieve that goal, we will have to reduce CO2 emissions between now and 2030, the equivalent of 3 COVID lockdowns, cumulatively.
What do you mean by the...
So in 2020, the amount of CO2 that we reduced during the COVID lockdown, we will have to do that 3 more times cumulatively on top of each other to meet that 2030 goal. One of 2 things is going to happen. Either it's simply not going to occur, or the cost to achieve that is going to be astronomical. So, right, the reduction in demand is going to have to be so huge that the costs of permits will go sky high. So my guess is that probably in 2028, when the next statewide elections are, we will see the legislature take action to change those targets or change the limits and things like that. But that's probably what's coming.
Mitchell, did you have another question?
Yeah. So then just to kind of follow up on the Commitment Act, the U.S. Supreme Court recently declined to hear an appeal on a lawsuit challenging it. Voters last year turned down an initiative that would have repealed it. Before that 2028 kind of timeline, do you think there's steps the legislature could take in the next, either this upcoming session or in future sessions, to kind of amend the law to make it more kind of, I guess, feasible or achievable beyond just changing the benchmarks or the targets?
Yeah, I think that as long as you treat the targets as binding, then anything you do is going to, cause a problem. Because if those benchmarks are binding, then like prices are going to have to go way up, and you're going to have to get very restrictive. So I think we're going to have to change those targets. Either we're going to have to say that those targets are not binding, or we're going to have to change them. The second thing that you could do is that right now, we've collected about $4 billion worth of taxes from the CCA, from the CO2 tax. That's part of the CCA. That money is not required to be spent effectively to reduce CO2. It's basically put to a lot of different political agendas rather than reducing CO2 emissions. So I'll give you an example. The Department of Ecology put out a report last November looking at the expenditures and looking at what the priorities are. And they have a column that says, okay, cost per metric ton. Now, I every year buy about 20 metric tons of CO2 offsets. That's basically roughly what I use. I'm a little bit more than most people because I fly. So that's basically what I use. It costs me $10 a metric ton. There are projects that the state is spending where they're spending $100,000 per metric ton. That's insane. That makes no sense. If you think that climate change is a crisis, you would never do that, because you would say that's a waste of money. The electric vehicle subsidy, the $45 million that was last year, we did a study on that. We found that the cost per metric ton was like $1,200, again, compared to $10. So another thing we could do is simply put in law that says we will do what Microsoft does: prioritize expenditures to reduce CO2 emissions based on impact, based on cost per metric ton, so you get the most bang for your buck. That may not close the gap that we need to close to meet those targets, but it's going to be a heck of a lot better than what we're doing now, which is spending literally billions of dollars and getting very little for it.
Recently put out a news release about the OSPI removing some data from their website. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that, as Mitchell mentioned, is that we sort of look at trends and are we meeting our goals. So I got interested in this when Governor Inslee took office, and he started something called Results Washington. The purpose of Results Washington was to set goals for the state and then manage to those goals. Are we meeting them? Are we not meeting them? If we're not meeting them, why? Let's fix it. And in 2019, on the environment, there was a number of different goals, and I think we were missing all but one of the environmental and climate goals under Jay Inslee. And about a month before he announced for president, they simply removed the whole webpage. Like all that data just disappeared, and so we were the ones to catch it and highlighted it. And like that, I think shows that for a lot of the tough talk about accountability, when push comes to shove, politicians don't like that accountability. So I sort of had flashbacks when I was dealing with the OSPI, Chris Reichdahl. They have a report card. They have a page with a report card that shows updated data. And it's actually, in a lot of ways, it's very useful. A lot of good information about schools and school districts and the state. But they also had a page that said, okay, here are the goals we're trying to meet by 2027. In 2017, they set these goals for 2027. They pushed them 2 years back because of COVID. I think that's totally appropriate. I understand why they did that to 2029. They want 90% proficiency in math and language and other areas. So they had a tab about how are we doing toward those goals. And I noticed that on that tab it said most recent data are 2018-2019 school year. Well, that's like, so, okay. So I emailed them and I said, did you just forget to update this? Like, is this wrong? Is this correct? How are we doing here? And they said, well, yes, the data are available on the report card, but we'll look at this and we'll get back to you. And I said, okay. I said, but are the data from the report card the same as these? And they said, we'll get back to you. So then a little over a week went by, and I emailed and I said, any news on this? and they didn't respond. So then a couple weeks later, the superintendent of public instruction held a press conference talking about how great our students were doing. And I said, really? So I went to that webpage, and it was gone. So there were two tabs. There's a tab for the report card and a tab for how are we meeting our goals, and the tab for are we meeting our goals was scrubbed, and you can't find it. So you can go back to the Wayback Machine and see it. It's on there on the Wayback Machine, but currently it's not there. Now, what they will say is, well, but the data are there elsewhere. Okay, that's fine, but the purpose of having that are we meeting our goals is to make it very clear and make it easy to hold the state accountable for achieving those targets that it said are important to meet. And the reason for removing them is because they're not up to date. They're not doing very well. And in fact, we're not close to meeting those targets. So I just think it's another example of when push comes to shove, politicians don't like accountability. And that's why, as you said, the Policy Center, our focus is in the long run. And so we pay attention to these things, and that's why we happen to find it.
Have you requested they put that back?
We have requested they put that back. They told another person who interviewed them, oh, we're working on it, we're updating it. Okay, I think that's all. That's fine. I hope it does come back. But it is not a coincidence that we asked the question and then suddenly it disappeared. So if it comes back bigger than better than ever, great. We will highlight that, and that will be great. And I don't know, maybe we'll count that as another example of ways that we can have impact on Washington State. But yeah, that's good. Look, our goal is to make Washington work better. And if Washington students can get better education, if we can become more affordable, if we can recover salmon and improve forest health and do all these things that we want to do, I don't really care who's governor or superintendent of public instruction as long as we're doing that. And some of the most joy that I get personally is working with people who are supposed to disagree with me, but then end up agreeing with me and we work together on something. And if we can do that on this, fantastic.
Mitchell.
Kind of switching topics a little bit. The big topic that dominated the last legislative session was tax plans.
Yeah.
The governor rejected two kind of larger tax proposals before ultimately settling on the tax package that passed. The recent revenue forecast that was released about 2.5 weeks or so ago kind of indicated that the package that was passed isn't collecting enough money, and in fact, revenue is projected to is declined by roughly $1 billion through 2029. As we kind of gear up towards this next legislative session, what do you anticipate and the response to that to be? Is it to look for additional savings or kind of reduce spending in the state's budget, or do you anticipate kind of a second round of taxes to be proposed?
My guess is that we will probably see a second round of taxes. There will certainly be areas that they cut. It'll be interesting. I think that the estimate is that they are $400 million short in this biennium. You mentioned the billion, and that's over 2 biennia. But the $400 million, so how do they close that gap? The other issue is that all of the state agencies have just turned in their budget requests for the supplemental budget. And I think that the Washington Research Council, I'm going through those now, I think the Washington Research Council said that there are $1.3 billion worth of requests for additional spending. So not only do we have a $400 million shortfall, we also have $1.3 billion extra. And then there are the questions about what's going to happen with federal funding. I think there's a lot of, for political reasons, there's a lot of pointing the finger at the federal government as the cause of this. But that's certainly a part of it, but that's not the only part by far. And then the last complication issue is that Mark Zandi of Moody's and others are saying that Washington State may already be in a recession. So that's only going to make the next budget forecast, which comes out next month, potentially worse. So there's a lot of pressures. We are compiling a list of areas that the state can cut and save money. As I mentioned, in the Climate Commitment Act, we spend a huge amount of money on projects that are not effective in terms of reducing CO2, that are essentially political. There's a long list of things where we could save hundreds of millions of dollars on those kinds of projects. And there's those sorts of things elsewhere. There's a lot of the budget requests that I think are sort of silly. I'll give you one that I came across, which is Washington State has what's called a certificate of need. If you want to start a hospital or a health clinic, you have to get essentially permission from the Department of Health. The way that program is funded is by fees when you file a certificate of need. There's a $600,000 request from the Department of Health saying, well, we need more money because nobody's filing any certificates of need. And so, here's an agency saying, we need more money because we're not doing anything. So there are examples like that. I think that obviously should be rejected. But when you go through these things, you find that there's a lot of things where simply it doesn't make sense, and areas that we are spending money on can be cut. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think they're going to find ways to increase taxes. Unfortunately, we just faced the largest tax increase in state history. They've indicated that they want to do more, and so I think that will unfortunately be part of it.
What are your priorities for this coming legislative session?
Well, I think we have some policy priorities, but I think that it's going to be very hard because almost every policy priority has at least some fiscal note attached to it for implementation. I'll give you one example of something we've worked on, and we've worked on actually with that I've worked on with salmon recovery activists and tribes in the last couple of years, is to reduce barriers for salmon recovery projects. But part of doing that is giving more authority to the Office of Regulatory Innovation and Assistance, what's called ORIA, to find those barriers and help eliminate them. So even though we're eliminating barriers, ironically, in the near term, there's actually a fiscal note. Well, that's probably not going to go anywhere for that reason. And a lot of other ideas that you would have some fiscal note attached to it. I think more likely what we're going to spend our time focusing on are what we just said, which is coming up with lists of projects that are not working, projects where you can save money, ways to spend money more efficiently or cut that funding. So I think that's going to be the primary focus, since that's what the legislature is going to be facing.
Mitchell.
One of the things you touched on was the tax package. Several of those taxes went into effect last week. One of them was a sales tax on services, and increased the state's B&O tax, and increased the Discover Pass. The gas tax increase took effect earlier this year. Yeah. Are there areas that you anticipate that you can imagine the state kind of looking to increase that tax revenue?
I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is it's about like the expanded tax on services and things like that. One of the challenges that I think that businesses face is knowing whether they are covered. And that's one of the stories that we have heard a lot with the new B&O taxes, is that there's a lot of businesses that didn't realize that they were going to end up paying those taxes. And I think we saw this with the capital gains income tax. A lot of people were asking, like, how does this apply? And the state said, well, we don't really know. We don't have the guidance yet. And you're seeing some of that same thing, which is that the state is struggling to figure out how to apply these rules written by the legislature sort of in a hurry, because they needed to figure out where to go get the money. So they wrote them in a hurry, and it's applying in ways that I think that they did not anticipate. In the near term, I think that's actually the biggest problem, is just trying to sort out what these taxes mean and who they apply to. Then we'll have a better idea of what the impact is.
Todd, I think we're kind of running low on time here, but is there anything else you want to bring up before we
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. Like I said, our goal is to work with whoever will work with us on these issues. We often find some unusual partners, groups that we may only agree with, say 20% of the time, but in that 20% of the time, it's nice to find those ways and make slow and steady progress. We released earlier this year what we called a report card for Washington's future, that just simply gives people the tools to see, is Washington headed in the right direction or the wrong direction on a number of different areas in terms of finances, transportation, environment, education, and elsewhere. I think is just any recovery program, any 12-step program, step one is admit you have a problem. And that's, I think a lot of times we like to deny that we have problems. In education, we certainly have a problem. We've seen test scores go down. We are now behind Mississippi on both reading and math. That indicates there's a problem. So that, I think, is one of the things that if people want to go and see where Washington State is doing and identify where we can fix those problems, and then we can take steps. We can say, okay, how can we solve these? And that, I think, is where one of the big areas of emphasis for the Washington Policy Center right now is just saying, here's the things that are going wrong. Here's the things that are going right. How can we do a better job at fixing these things? And where we can find support across the political spectrum, we will do it. But that's our focus.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me.